Naomi adjusted the strap of her bag as she rushed through the bustling lobby of the Sterling Regent Hotel. The air smelled faintly of fresh lilies, the signature scent they pumped in to make guests feel like they had arrived somewhere important. Naomi didn't have time to appreciate it. She had 3 back-to-back corporate events running tonight, and a tray of champagne glasses had just gone down in the ballroom. Someone had texted her in a panic about a seating mishap, and her phone was buzzing again, probably the kitchen, warning her that the vegetarian entrees were taking longer than expected. She checked the time. Eli's bedtime. Guilt flickered through her. She had barely seen him today, only managing a quick hug before leaving him with Mrs. Patel, the retired teacher next door who had been a lifesaver. Naomi told herself she was working late for him, for stability, for a future where she wouldn't have to double-check her bank account before agreeing to a weekend trip to the zoo. A familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Hey, workaholic, you're off duty now." Claire stood near the entrance, holding out a garment bag like a peace offering. She was all effortless elegance, her deep green dress hugging her curves in a way that made Naomi envious. Claire was the kind of woman who could turn heads just by existing. Naomi barely slowed. Not happening. 3 events tonight. Correction, 2 now. I saw the banquet wrapping up on my way in. The others can survive without you. Claire smirked. You, on the other hand, need a night off. I'm fine. You're exhausted. And you promised me, remember? 1 night. Champagne. Maybe some reckless flirting, which you're overdue for. Naomi rolled her eyes but stopped walking. Claire had a point. She couldn't remember the last time she had done something for herself. I don't have a dress, Naomi tried. Claire unzipped the bag with a dramatic flourish. Fix that for you. 10 minutes later, Naomi was in the staff restroom, shimmying into the dress Claire had picked, black, sleek, something that made her feel like she belonged at the kind of event she usually organized from behind the scenes. The gala was in full swing when they entered. Gold light shimmered from chandeliers, casting warm reflections on the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits. A jazz quartet played in the corner, and waiters glided between guests with trays of champagne. Naomi felt out of place, hyper-aware of every wrinkle in her dress, every stray thought about Eli, every moment she could be working instead. Claire handed her a glass. Relax. Enjoy. For once, just exist without fixing everything around you. Naomi took a sip and tried. She really did. She let Claire lead her toward a group of people laughing near the terrace. She let herself get lost in meaningless small talk about vacation homes and art auctions. But just as she was starting to settle into the idea of pretending to belong, Claire's fingers clamped around her wrist. "Oh my God," Claire whispered. "Naomi, that woman looks exactly like you." Naomi turned, following Claire's wide-eyed stare, and felt the world tilt. Across the room, near the bar, a woman stood in deep conversation with Dominic Wolfe. The Dominic Wolfe, billionaire investor, private art collector, the kind of man whose presence made everyone in the room recalibrate their body language to appear more interesting, more important. And next to him, laughing at something he said, was Naomi. No. Not Naomi. But her. Naomi's breath caught. The woman was identical, same sharp cheekbones, same full lips, same dark hair falling just past her shoulders in soft waves. Even the way she stood, shifting her weight slightly onto one hip, looked eerily familiar. Then, as if sensing she was being watched, the woman lifted a hand and tucked her hair behind her ear. Naomi's stomach twisted. It was an old habit. One she had never thought about, never realized was something specific to her. And yet, there it was, mirrored perfectly by a woman who shouldn't exist. Claire let out a stunned breath. Naomi, how is this possible? Naomi forced a laugh, though it came out unsteady. I guess everyone has a doppelganger somewhere, right? Claire didn't look convinced. A doppelganger is someone who kind of looks like you. This is freaky. Have you ever met her before? No. Naomi turned away, suddenly needing air. She didn't believe in bizarre coincidences, but she also wasn't about to spiral into conspiracy theories. The woman was probably just someone with similar features. That was all. Still, she couldn't bring herself to look again. She distracted herself with another drink. With meaningless conversations. With anything except the magnetic pull of that identical face across the room. It was late by the time Naomi slipped into her apartment. The quiet of the space felt stark after the noise of the gala. She tiptoed past Eli's room, peeking in. He was sprawled across his bed, his stuffed elephant clutched to his chest, breathing deeply. She pressed a kiss to his forehead, lingering longer than usual, and then made her way to her own room. She tried to push it from her mind, but as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the image came back. The woman. The way she stood. The way she moved. That small, specific motion of tucking her hair behind her ear. Naomi turned over, closing her eyes tightly. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But still, sleep wouldn't come. Naomi shuffled into the staff lounge, gripping her coffee like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. The hotel hummed with its usual morning energy, housekeeping carts rolling past, concierges murmuring into earpieces, the distant clatter of dishes from the restaurant. None of it felt real. It was like she was walking through a scene she'd rehearsed too many times, hitting her marks but unable to focus on her lines. Her reflection in the lounge mirror was not helping. She looked exactly how she felt, like someone who had gotten 5 hours of restless sleep and spent most of them thinking about something she shouldn't be thinking about. The woman. The impossible woman. Rough night? Luis, one of the bellhops, dropped onto the couch beside her, balancing a breakfast sandwich in one hand and his phone in the other. You look like my grandma's cat after it got stuck in the dryer. Naomi let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a groan. That's horrifying. I mean, the cat was fine. Just very confused. That makes two of us. Before he could ask, she pushed herself up from the couch. I have to check on the ballroom setup. She wove through the lobby, trying to shake the heavy feeling pressing down on her. Everything was exactly as it should be. The flower arrangements had arrived on time. The guest list was finalized. Nothing was out of place, except for the gnawing sense that something was. She was nearly at the ballroom when a guest stepped in front of her, blocking her path. Older, well-dressed, the kind of man who had the effortless confidence of someone used to 5-star service. His face lit up. Olivia, he said warmly. I didn't know you were back in town. Naomi blinked. Sorry, what? He laughed. Come on, don't pretend you don't recognize me. Her stomach clenched. She had dealt with confused guests before, tourists convinced they'd seen her on TV, business executives mistaking her for someone they'd met at another hotel. This was different. He wasn't questioning. He was certain. She forced a polite smile. I think you have the wrong person. The man frowned slightly, tilting his head. Really? He studied her face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. You're not Olivia Loran? The name hit her like a shove. No, she said too quickly. I'm Naomi Sterling. He hesitated, then shook his head, chuckling. Well, you're her twin, then. Uncanny. She excused herself as fast as possible, practically speed-walking down the hall. Her heart was pounding. Olivia Loran. The woman had a name. She wasn't just a bizarre trick of lighting or a coincidence Naomi could brush off. She made it to the ballroom, hoping the familiar routine would ground her, but the second she stepped inside, Jackie from catering waved her over. Hey, are you feeling better today? Naomi frowned. What? Jackie wiped her hands on her apron. After you left early yesterday. You seemed kind of out of it. Naomi stared. I didn't leave early. Jackie gave her a look like she wasn't sure if Naomi was joking. Yeah, you did. You were covering the private dinner, and then halfway through, you said you weren't feeling well and clocked out. No. That wasn't possible. She had been here all night. She forced a laugh. I think you're mixing me up with someone else. Jackie still looked skeptical but shrugged. Maybe. But I swear I saw you heading out before dessert. Naomi's pulse was roaring in her ears. She spent the rest of the day pretending she wasn't unraveling. She threw herself into work, making sure the afternoon conferences ran smoothly, double-checking the evening reservations, even fixing a last-minute seating issue that no one else wanted to deal with. But beneath it all, the questions pressed in. The man in the lobby. The name Olivia Laurent. The way Jackie was so sure she had left early. She barely made it through her shift without snapping at someone. When she finally got home, Eli was already asleep, curled up in his usual tangle of blankets. She kissed his forehead, lingering there for a moment before slipping into her own room. Her phone was on the nightstand. She told herself not to do it. She told herself it wouldn't help. Then she picked it up anyway. She pulled up a search bar and typed the name. Olivia Laurent. There were articles. Pictures. Interviews. Naomi's breath caught as the first image loaded. A press photo from an art gala 3 weeks ago. It was like looking into a mirror. Same dark hair. Same sharp jawline. Even the same way she held herself, shoulders back, chin lifted slightly like she was used to being watched. Naomi scrolled further, scanning through headlines. Olivia Laurent, high-profile art curator. Regular presence at elite events. Private. Elusive. She clicked on another picture, one from last night's gala. There, standing beside Dominic Wolfe, was Olivia. Naomi's hands tightened around the phone. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was her. Naomi sat at her kitchen table, phone in one hand, a half-forgotten cup of coffee in the other. The screen glowed with search results, the name Olivia Laurent filling every line. There were articles from glossy magazines, interviews from high-profile art publications, photographs from exclusive gallery openings. The more she scrolled, the more surreal it became. Olivia wasn't just some socialite. She was a high-profile curator, moving in circles Naomi had only seen in headlines, the kind of woman who had private invitations to events Naomi worked behind the scenes. She clicked on an article from last fall, an interview where Olivia discussed an exhibit she had curated in Paris. The woman in the accompanying photo looked poised, elegant, effortlessly composed. It made Naomi's stomach turn. The resemblance wasn't just uncanny, it was absolute. There was no logical way to explain it. The shape of her eyes, the angle of her jaw, even the small, almost imperceptible scar near her left eyebrow that Naomi had since childhood. She pulled up another photo, this one from a recent event in London. Olivia was smiling at the camera, standing next to a collector whose name Naomi didn't recognize. The dress she wore was stunning, sleek black with delicate embroidery. Naomi stared, suddenly lightheaded. She knew that dress. Not from a magazine or a store, but in a way that made no sense. She could feel the weight of the fabric, the cool touch of silk against her skin. Her breath came quicker. Maybe she had seen this woman somewhere before. Maybe she had come across her picture once and simply forgotten, and now her mind was playing tricks on her. Or maybe, and this was the thought she was desperately trying to push away, there was something more to it. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then she typed it, Olivia Laurent before 2019. Nothing. No childhood photos, no mentions of a university or a first job. No awkward early interviews, no personal details beyond the past 5 years. It was as if Olivia Loran had simply appeared, fully formed, the moment she entered high society. Naomi set her phone down, pressing her palms against the table. There had to be an explanation. People didn't just materialize out of nowhere. Her phone buzzed with a work notification. She glanced at the time and swore under her breath. She was going to be late. By the time she made it to the hotel, she was behind on everything. There were last-minute changes to the ballroom setup, a VIP guest who had very particular requests about the temperature of his water, and a mix-up with the floral arrangements. Naomi barely had a second to think about Olivia Loran, until her boss caught her near the elevators. "I hope you're feeling better," Mr. Hargrove said, glancing at her with mild concern. Naomi frowned. "Better?" He nodded. "After calling in sick the other day. Louise covered for you." Her stomach dropped. "I didn't call in sick." Hargrove tilted his head, clearly waiting for her to catch the joke. "Naomi, you literally texted me. Said you weren't feeling well, needed the day off." "No, I didn't." His smile faltered. "You don't remember?" "Because it didn't happen. She had been here 2 days ago." She remembered the entire shift, the long hours, the meeting about the upcoming charity gala, the way she had stayed late organizing a vendor list. "Huh." Hargrove gave her a slightly uneasy look. "Well, you're back now, so that's what matters." Naomi nodded, not trusting herself to say anything else. The conversation sat heavy with her for the rest of the day. She kept turning it over in her mind, trying to find a reasonable answer. Maybe it was some kind of mix-up. Maybe Louise had been covering for someone else, and Hargrove just assumed it was her. Or maybe, her hands tightened on the clipboard she was holding, maybe something was happening that she couldn't explain. By the time her shift ended, she was drained. She picked up Eli from Mrs. Patel's, helped him with his spelling homework, made dinner, and got him into bed. She told herself she wouldn't look up Olivia again. But as soon as the apartment was quiet, she was back at the kitchen table, phone in hand. She scrolled through more pictures, more interviews, looking for something, anything, that could explain this. A past she had overlooked. A mistake in the timeline. The last thing she remembered was staring at a photograph from a gala 6 months ago, Olivia standing beside Dominic Wolfe. The moment stretched, the image tilting slightly in her vision. Then, Naomi's eyes snapped open. She was sitting in the living room. The lamp was still on, casting a dim glow over the space. Her phone was next to her on the couch, screen dark. She looked down. She was still in her work clothes. Her blazer, the blouse she had buttoned up that morning, the shoes she didn't remember kicking off. Her pulse roared in her ears. She had no memory of getting here. No memory of standing up, walking away from the kitchen, sitting down on the couch. She checked the time. It was almost 3 in the morning. She squeezed her hands into fists, trying to steady her breathing. Something was wrong. Naomi tapped her pen against her desk, staring at the open tab on her laptop. The words blurred together, but her brain kept circling the same thought, the same impossible question. Olivia Loran would be at a gallery opening tomorrow night. A small, exclusive event at the Halsted Museum, the kind of place where guests arrived in town cars and sipped champagne while pretending to be deeply moved by art they might buy but never hang. The invitation list was locked down, entry limited to collectors, curators, and the kind of people whose names carried weight. Naomi wasn't on the list. But she knew how events worked. Knew how to move in the background, how to blend in, how to make herself part of the scenery. She was going. Her hands were steady as she typed a quick email to an old contact at Halsted's catering team. A simple request, an extra set of hands for the night. Staff changed all the time. No one would question one more person carrying a tray of champagne. By the next afternoon, she had a uniform waiting for her at the back entrance. She arrived at the museum an hour before the event started, slipping in through the side door with a group of catering staff. The black button-up, neatly pressed slacks, and low heels were all familiar, the kind of thing she had worn 100 times before. The security guards barely glanced at her as she walked in, focused on checking guests at the front entrance. Inside, the gallery was bathed in soft golden light, the walls lined with contemporary paintings and sculptures that looked expensive in that vague, confusing way that modern art always did. Servers moved through the space in synchronized efficiency, trays balanced with practiced ease. Naomi picked up an empty tray and pretended to check for smudges. She wasn't here to serve drinks. She scanned the room, heart pounding. No sign of Olivia yet. She positioned herself near a large abstract painting, its brushstrokes bold and erratic, the kind of piece people nodded at while pretending to understand. Her stomach clenched as she watched guests filter in, elegantly dressed, their conversations easy and unhurried. And then, there she was. Olivia Loran walked through the arched entrance, effortless in a dark green gown, the fabric hugging her frame before pooling gracefully at her feet. Her hair was swept into a sleek chignon, a few loose strands framing her face. Naomi felt lightheaded. It was like looking at a reflection, a version of herself that had stepped into an entirely different world. Olivia greeted the curator with a polite smile, exchanged air kisses with a woman in a diamond necklace that could probably pay Naomi's rent for the next decade. Every movement was poised, every detail carefully curated. Naomi tried to breathe evenly, but her pulse hammered in her ears. She had to get closer. Balancing the tray in one hand, she took slow, deliberate steps toward Olivia's side of the room. She rehearsed the words in her head, though she had no idea what she was actually going to say. Olivia Loran. Do you know me? Have you seen me before? 5 more steps. Olivia turned slightly, her profile sharp in the light. 3 more. Naomi parted her lips, ready to speak. And then, everything shifted. The room dissolved into nothing. Naomi blinked, her vision blurring. A gust of cold air wrapped around her, sharp and disorienting. She was outside. The street was quiet. The neon glow of a nearby restaurant sign flickered, its hum the only sound against the stillness of the night. Her breath came in uneven gasps. She was standing on the sidewalk across from the museum. Her hands were empty. No tray. No uniform. No memory of leaving. Her fingers trembled as she looked back toward the building. Through the tall windows, she could still see the event unfolding, the guests moving through the gallery, the flash of Olivia's gown as she turned toward someone new. Naomi's stomach lurched. She had been inside. She had been inches away. And now she was here. Her pulse roared in her ears. She had no idea how she had gotten there. Naomi sat in the cafe across from Wolf International, stirring a cup of tea she hadn't taken a single sip from. The high-rise loomed over the street, glass panels reflecting the city skyline. Every inch of it screamed power, money, exclusivity, the kind of place where security wouldn't hesitate to escort her out the second they sensed she didn't belong. She wasn't exactly sure what her plan was. All she knew was that Dominic Wolf was one of the few people in Olivia Loran's world who might have real answers. And she needed answers. The rational part of her brain told her this was a terrible idea. The man was a billionaire. A private, influential businessman who had built his empire on calculated risks and ruthless decisions. He was not someone who entertained random strangers off the street. But the other part of her, the part that had seen a woman who looked exactly like her, who had lost time, who had woken up in places without remembering how she got there, had stopped caring about logic. She pulled out her phone, opened the voice recording app, and hit record. If she was going to pretend to be a journalist, she needed at least one believable prop. Then she stood, smoothed out her jacket, and walked through the revolving doors like she belonged there. The lobby was sleek and minimalist, all marble and steel, the kind of place where people spoke in hushed tones and moved with a sense of urgency. A receptionist looked up as she approached, polished and unreadable. "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" Naomi tightened her grip on her phone. "I'm Naomi Sterling, with the Art Review." She kept her voice steady, even as her heart pounded. "I'm here for a last-minute interview with Mr. Wolf regarding the Halstead exhibit." The receptionist frowned slightly, fingers hovering over her keyboard. "I don't see an appointment scheduled." "It was arranged this morning," Naomi lied. "Short notice." His assistant confirmed. There was a beat of hesitation, then a polite but firm smile. "Let me check with his office." "Please have a seat." Naomi nodded, walked toward the plush leather chairs in the waiting area, and forced herself to stay still. Her pulse hammered as she glanced at the towering screen displaying financial reports and corporate updates. She wasn't expecting this to work. She figured she'd get turned away, or security would escort her out before she even got close. But then... "Miss Sterling?" She turned. A man in a fitted suit, someone who screamed high-level assistant, gestured for her to follow him. "Mr. Wolf can see you now." Her breath caught. She wasn't ready. Too late. She was already walking. She was led through a set of glass doors into an expansive office. The view stretched across the city, the skyline framed by floor-to-ceiling windows. Dominic Wolf stood behind his desk, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, every inch of him sharp and unreadable. She had seen his face in magazines before. High-profile interviews, photos from charity galas. Up close, he was even more intimidating, controlled, deliberate, the kind of man who didn't waste words. His gaze settled on her, and something flickered in his expression. She opened her mouth, ready to launch into whatever flimsy excuse she had for being here, but he spoke first. "This isn't funny," he said, his voice quiet but cutting. Naomi blinked. "Whatever game you're playing, it ends now." His jaw tightened. "Olivia is in Milan right now." The words landed like a physical blow. Milan. He was looking at her, speaking to her, yet he was so utterly convinced she wasn't Olivia. She felt her stomach twist. "You think I'm..." she swallowed. "I don't know what you think, but I'm not playing anything. I needed to ask." He exhaled sharply, stepping around the desk. "You show up here, pretending to be a journalist, using a fake name, and you expect me to entertain this?" His voice was ice. "If Olivia were here, I'd know." The certainty in his tone rattled her. She wanted to tell him she wasn't lying, that she hadn't made any of this up. That she wasn't pretending to be Olivia Loran, she was Naomi Sterling, and something was very, very wrong. But she couldn't get the words out. Because what if she was Olivia? What if she had been here before? What if the gaps in her memory weren't random, but something much worse? His eyes didn't leave hers, scrutinizing every detail of her face, searching for something she didn't understand. Then, finally, he gave a small, humorless laugh. "You're good," he said. "I'll give you that." The way he said it made her feel sick. Her fingers curled into fists. "I'm not." "Get out." The command was final. No room for argument, no room for anything except the cold weight of humiliation crashing over her. Her chest tightened. She turned and bolted before she could fall apart in front of him. She barely registered the sound of her heels against the sleek floors, barely noticed the blur of the lobby as she pushed through the revolving doors and stumbled onto the sidewalk. Her breath came fast, uneven. She had walked straight into the lion's den, and Dominic Wolf hadn't even hesitated. He thought she was a fraud. Maybe he was right. Naomi stood in her kitchen, staring at the open fridge, completely forgetting why she had even opened it. The air hummed with the faint buzz of the overhead light, the smell of last night's takeout still lingering. Eli's half-finished cereal bowl sat on the counter, the milk now congealed, forgotten in the morning rush. Her phone vibrated on the table. She grabbed it, glancing at the screen. Claire, last night was fun. I told you that place had the best martinis. Naomi frowned. She read the text again. Then again. Last night? She had been home last night. She had picked Eli up from Mrs. Patel's, made grilled cheese for dinner, helped him with a school project about planets, and then tucked him into bed while he made her promise she'd take him to the museum this weekend. Her heart started to pound. She typed back quickly. Naomi, what are you talking about? The typing bubble appeared immediately. Claire, what do you mean? We had dinner, then went to that new bar in Soho. You were the one who wanted to stay for another drink. Naomi's mouth went dry. She leaned against the counter, trying to slow her breathing. She pressed her fingers to her temples, squeezing her eyes shut. This was a mistake. A mix-up. Claire must have gone out with someone else. She forced herself to type again. Naomi, I was home last night. Claire's response was instant. Claire, are you messing with me? We literally took a selfie. Look. A photo appeared. Naomi's stomach dropped. It was her. Her face, her hair swept back, a glass in her hand, a dimly lit bar behind her. Claire was next to her, grinning. She felt lightheaded, gripping the edge of the counter for balance. This wasn't possible. She hadn't gone out. She hadn't. Her phone buzzed again. Claire, are you okay? Naomi didn't answer. She didn't know how to. She scrolled through her camera roll, but there was nothing there. No picture. No record of it ever happening. She checked her call log. Nothing. She checked her credit card transactions. No charges from a bar. She wanted to tell herself that meant it wasn't real, that Claire was mistaken. But the photo was real. And worse, Claire had no doubt that it had happened. Her head ached. At work, things only got worse. She was halfway through checking vendor invoices when Jackie from catering leaned against her desk. Wild weekend, huh? Naomi looked up. What? Jackie smirked. At the rooftop bar. Luis saw you there on Saturday. Naomi felt something tighten in her chest. She forced a casual shrug. I wasn't at a bar this weekend. Jackie frowned. He was pretty sure it was you. Said you were wearing that black dress you love. The black dress. The one hanging in her closet. The one she hadn't worn in weeks. A slow panic crawled through her. She had spent Saturday with Eli. They had built a blanket fort in the living room, watched a movie, and then she had fallen asleep on the couch. She remembered it. Didn't she? Her hands felt cold. She needed to go home. She made it through the rest of her shift on autopilot. When she got home, she immediately checked her closet. The black dress was still there. She picked it up. It smelled faintly of perfume. A scent she didn't recognize. Her breath came too fast. Her hands were shaking as she sat on the bed, phone clutched tight, scrolling through her messages, her emails, her call log, desperate to find something that would make sense of this. And then a text arrived. A name she didn't expect. Dominic Wolfe. Her pulse thundered. She hesitated, then opened the message. Hope you made it home safe. You were mesmerizing last night. Naomi's vision blurred. She dropped the phone. She had been at home. Hadn't she? Naomi sat at a quiet corner table in the kind of cafe where the coffee was overpriced, the pastries looked too perfect to eat, and everyone spoke in careful, hushed tones. The kind of place Olivia Loran would frequent. The reservation had been easy to arrange. A few emails, the right amount of vague interest in emerging artists, and the promise of a generous investment in one of Olivia's upcoming exhibitions. People like Olivia didn't handle business over the phone. They preferred face-to-face meetings, something about energy, presence, connection. Naomi checked her watch. 10 minutes until Olivia was supposed to arrive. She took a slow breath, steadying her hands around the warm ceramic of her coffee cup. She had rehearsed this conversation over and over in her head. How she would introduce herself. How she would carefully steer the conversation, watching Olivia's face for any flicker of recognition, any slip of hesitation. Because Olivia had to know something. The gaps in Naomi's memory were getting worse. The messages from Dominic. The photo Claire had sent. The nights she swore she had been home, only to find out she had been somewhere else entirely. It all came back to Olivia. A waiter passed by, glancing at her half-empty coffee. She waved him off before he could offer a refill. She looked toward the entrance, heart hammering. Any second now. The cafe door swung open, letting in a rush of cool air. And then everything shifted. She blinked. The cafe was different. Not in a dramatic way, not like she had been transported to another city or another time, but something was off. The angle. The view. The light filtering through the windows. She was no longer at her original table. Her coffee sat in front of her, untouched, the surface of the liquid smooth and undisturbed. The warmth had disappeared. She checked the time. 45 minutes had passed. Her breath caught in her throat. She scanned the cafe, searching for Olivia, for any sign that the meeting had happened, that she had spoken to her, that there was some explanation for this. But Olivia was nowhere to be seen. Naomi gripped the edge of the table, a cold sweat breaking out along her spine. She had missed her. Again. And she had no idea how. Naomi sat at her kitchen table, laptop open, coffee untouched. The apartment was quiet, except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the wall clock. Eli was at school, and for the first time in days, she had a stretch of uninterrupted time. No work shifts, no obligations, no one to tell her she was imagining things. She wasn't imagining things. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed Olivia Laurent background into the search bar. She had done this before, late at night, half in denial, skimming through articles that all said the same thing. Olivia Laurent, renowned art curator. A rising star in the industry. A woman whose taste was impeccable, whose connections were enviable, whose life seemed perfectly cultivated. This time, she wasn't looking for the same recycled information. She scrolled past the interviews, past the event photos, past the breathless praise in magazine features. She needed something real. Something from before. But there was nothing. She typed Olivia Laurent early life and got vague, polished statements. No details. No childhood photos. No university records. No mentions of family. It was like Olivia had appeared out of thin air 5 years ago. Naomi's stomach twisted. She tried public records next. Property ownership, old addresses, anything. But the name Olivia Laurent didn't exist before 2019. There was no record of her life before then. Her pulse pounded as she switched tactics, searching through databases meant for journalists, records that weren't always publicly available but could be accessed with the right persistence. It was slow, tedious work, but she had spent years managing events, fixing impossible problems, solving crises that people swore couldn't be solved. She knew how to dig. An hour passed, then 2. Then something. A hospital admission. Her breath caught as she opened the file. The patient was admitted 5 years ago. The injuries were severe. Head trauma, extensive rehabilitation, a long period of recovery. The name attached to the earliest record wasn't Olivia Laurent. It was Naomi Sterling. Her hands shook as she stared at the screen. She read the name again. Again. She wasn't Olivia Lawrence's double. She was Olivia Loran. Naomi stormed through the revolving doors of Wolf International, gripping the folder so tightly her knuckles ached. The lobby was just as polished and intimidating as before, but this time, she wasn't pretending. She wasn't playing the role of a journalist or an investor or a woman politely asking for answers. She wasn't even sure who she was anymore. The receptionist looked up, startled. "Miss, do you have an Dominic Wolf?" Naomi said sharply. "Now." The receptionist opened her mouth, probably to tell her that appointments were required, that he was unavailable, that she needed to calm down. But something in Naomi's expression must have stopped her. She hesitated, then reached for the phone. Naomi didn't wait for permission. She strode past the desk, heading straight for the elevators. Security would probably stop her in 30 seconds, but she didn't care. The doors were just beginning to close when a firm hand stopped them. Dominic stood there, suit perfect, expression unreadable. His gaze flicked to the folder in her hands. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Too bad," she snapped, stepping back so he had no choice but to enter the elevator with her. The doors slid shut, and they were alone. She turned to him, pulse hammering. "Tell me the truth." He didn't even blink. "About what?" She yanked open the folder and shoved the hospital records toward him. "Don't do that. Don't act like you don't know exactly what this is." His eyes moved over the pages, and for the briefest second, barely long enough to register, his face went pale. Then it was gone. The composed, calculated businessman was back. "Where did you get this? That's all you have to say?" Her voice wavered, but she didn't care. "Not, Naomi, let me explain." "Not, wow, you finally figured it out." He exhaled sharply and pinched the bridge of his nose. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand." The elevator doors opened to his office floor, but neither of them moved. His jaw tightened. "Come with me." She followed him down the hall, through sleek glass doors, into his office. He shut the door behind her and turned, the weight of something unspoken heavy between them. "I was going to tell you," he said finally. She let out a sharp laugh. "Really? When? Before or after I lost another night of my life?" Dominic ran a hand through his hair, the first real sign of frustration she had ever seen from him. "Sit down, Naomi." She didn't move. His expression flickered. "Fine. You want the truth? Here it is." She braced herself. "You were in an accident 5 years ago. A bad one." His voice was measured, careful. "You were found unconscious, no ID, nothing to identify you. The doctors didn't think you'd make it. And when you did, you didn't remember anything. Not your name. Not your life. Not even your own reflection." Naomi's breath caught. "You were lost." His voice softened, just slightly. "And he hesitated. "I gave you a new life. A fresh start. Olivia Loran." She pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to absorb the weight of his words. She had been Olivia all along. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice came out small. Dominic exhaled. "Because by the time I realized you were remembering things, it was too late. You had already built a life as Olivia. I thought," he stopped himself. "I thought it was better this way." Naomi felt like the ground had been pulled from beneath her. She had spent 5 years living someone else's life. And Dominic had let her. Naomi sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the hospital records spread out in front of her. Her own name looked foreign now, like it belonged to someone else. Maybe it did. Her hands were still shaking. She tried to steady them, pressing her palms against her thighs, but it didn't help. None of this felt real. She had been in an accident. A bad one. 5 years ago, in another country, far from everything she knew. She forced herself to retrace it, to put the pieces together the way she would if this were someone else's crisis, someone else's life unraveling. The hospital files listed the date, 5 years ago. A patient, unidentified, pulled from the wreckage of a car outside of Madrid. No ID. No phone. No record of where she had been heading or where she had come from. She had been alone. Her injuries were extensive. Head trauma. Broken ribs. Weeks of unconsciousness. By the time she woke up, there was nothing left of her past. No name, no childhood, no history. Dominic had found her. He must have been there, or maybe he had come later, but at some point, he had walked into that hospital room and made a decision. He hadn't told her who she was. He hadn't tried to find her family. He had given her a new name. A new life. Olivia Laurent. She pressed her fingers to her temples. The name was suddenly unbearable, like an ill-fitting coat she had never noticed was suffocating her. Her family must have thought she was dead. Eli. The thought hit her like a physical blow. Her son. The life she had before. She had spent 5 years walking around in a stranger's world while Eli had been growing up without her. She dug through the files again, searching for something, anything, that would explain why Dominic had done this. Why had he let her believe she was someone else? She had been Naomi Sterling. A mother. A daughter. A person with a past, with people who loved her. Now she was Olivia Laurent. A polished, sophisticated woman with no history before 2019. Both versions of herself clawed at her mind, neither willing to let go. Which one was real? Naomi sat in her apartment, legs folded beneath her on the couch, staring at the framed picture on the bookshelf. It was a simple photo, Eli at 4 years old, grinning as he held up a messy crayon drawing of a rocket ship. She remembered the day he had made it. He had been obsessed with space, asking endless questions about astronauts and black holes and whether or not the moon had a bedtime. She had been Naomi then. But had she? Her fingers hovered over the edge of the frame, not quite touching it. A week ago, she wouldn't have questioned whether that memory was hers. Now, she wasn't so sure. She thought about the nights she couldn't remember. The places she had been when she was supposed to be home. The text messages, the phone calls, the lingering scent of perfume on dresses she hadn't worn. She had been living 2 lives. Not in the way a secret agent or a con artist might. Not in a way that felt intentional. It had been happening without her knowing. When she was Naomi, when she was with Eli, when she was exhausted at the hotel, when she was making dinner and running errands and folding his tiny socks, Olivia didn't exist. The name, the persona, the life Dominic had built for her was nothing more than a shadow, a vague feeling of unease she couldn't quite explain. But when she was Olivia, everything reversed. Naomi wasn't real. She was the bad dream. The half-formed ghost of someone Olivia assumed she had once known but had long since forgotten. She had spent years slipping between the two without realizing. Her hands curled into fists. She thought about the nights she had blacked out. The conversations she didn't remember having. The events she had supposedly attended, the drinks she had supposedly ordered, the men who had spoken to her like she was someone they knew. She thought about Dominic. Had he known? Had he watched as she shifted between these two people, waiting for the moment she would finally snap, waiting for the day she would figure it out? Her stomach twisted. She had spent 5 years as Olivia Laurent. 5 years at galas, in art galleries, in a world of polished elegance and careful detachment. 5 years in a life that had been made for her, shaped around her like a tailored dress that almost, but not quite, fit. But she had also spent those years as Naomi Sterling. As a mother. As a woman who worked long hours, who paid bills and made doctor's appointments and read bedtime stories. Neither life felt like an illusion. That was the worst part. They both felt real. Two versions of herself, neither willing to step aside. And she had no idea which one she was supposed to be. Naomi sat across from Dominic in his impossibly sleek office, the skyline stretching behind him in a perfect display of power and control. He leaned forward, hands clasped, his expression unreadable. The polished businessman. The man who had created her, in a way. "You don't have to throw this away," he said, voice steady, deliberate. "You've built something incredible as Olivia. A career. A reputation. A life people envy." She exhaled sharply. "A life I didn't choose." Dominic's jaw tightened, just barely. "I gave you a fresh start when you had nothing. When you had no one." Her stomach twisted. "I had someone," she said quietly. "I had Eli." The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. "You don't remember what it was like," Dominic finally said. "You don't remember waking up in that hospital, looking at me like I was a stranger, because I was a stranger. You were lost, Naomi. I didn't steal your life, I gave you a new one because the old one was gone." She shook her head. "That wasn't your decision to make." His voice softened. "You're Olivia now. You have been for 5 years. You can't just walk away from that." She wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him that of course she could, that she had a child, a family, people who had never stopped missing her. But the truth was, Olivia wasn't just some identity forced on her. She had lived that life. Had shaped it. Had become it. She had spent years walking through glittering galleries, sipping champagne at elegant parties, sitting on panels, shaping exhibitions. She had friends, real ones. People who looked at her and saw someone they trusted, someone they admired. She had memories of laughter, of success, of nights spent on rooftops in Paris, watching the city lights flicker below. The problem was, she also had memories of Eli falling asleep on her shoulder. Of nights spent balancing work and motherhood, exhaustion weighing heavy but never enough to dull the warmth of his tiny hand in hers. She had lived both lives. How was she supposed to erase one? Her phone buzzed. "Claire." She hesitated before answering. "Tell me you're done with this," Claire's voice came through, edged with frustration. "Tell me you're coming home." Naomi let out a slow breath. "Claire." "You don't owe him anything," Claire cut in. "This world, this Olivia thing, it was never real. It was built on a lie. And you know that." Her throat tightened. "You have a son," Claire said, voice breaking slightly. "Eli still needs you." Naomi closed her eyes. Dominic was watching her carefully. "You have a choice," he said, quiet but firm. "Stay. Keep what you've built. Or go back and lose everything we created." She gripped the phone, heart pounding. Who was she supposed to be? A soft whimper echoed through the apartment, pulling Naomi from the restless haze of sleep. At first, she wasn't sure if she had imagined it, but then, another small, broken cry. "Eli." She was out of bed before she could think, feet moving on instinct, crossing the darkened hallway to his room. The glow-in-the-dark stars on his ceiling flickered faintly in the dim light, casting tiny galaxies across the walls. His blankets were tangled around him, his face scrunched in distress. "Eli," she murmured, lowering herself beside him. "Hey, baby, wake up." His breathing hitched as he stirred, his little body trembling. "Shoo," she whispered, brushing his damp curls back from his forehead. "It's okay. Mommy's here." The words left her mouth before she had a chance to consider them, before she could analyze or hesitate or question. They came out naturally, effortlessly, like they had been waiting, ready to remind her of the truth. "Mommy's here. Not Olivia." Not an art curator who spent her nights at elegant parties, sipping champagne with strangers who knew nothing real about her. Not the woman Dominic had sculpted out of necessity or guilt or whatever complicated reason had made him decide she was better off as someone else. She was Eli's mother. She was Naomi Sterling. And nothing else mattered. Eli shifted, his fingers curling into the fabric of her shirt, his small, warm body seeking the comfort he had always known, even when she hadn't. She held him close, pressing a kiss to his temple, breathing in the familiar scent of him. The weight of her decision settled in her chest, not a burden, but a certainty. There was no more confusion. No more split identities warring inside her. She wasn't lost. She had never been lost. She had just needed to remember. Naomi stood in Dominic's office, the weight of her decision pressing into her chest, making it difficult to breathe. The air in the room was thick with the kind of silence that felt permanent, final. She had thought this conversation through 100 different ways, but now that she was here, standing across from the man who had built her into someone she wasn't, the words caught in her throat. Dominic sat behind his desk, fingers steepled together, his gaze locked onto her like he was still trying to figure out if she was serious. She had just told him, plain and clear, that she was leaving. That Olivia Laurent was gone. That she wasn't staying in this world he had created for her. "You're sure?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it, something close to disbelief. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Yes." He exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. His face remained unreadable, but she had spent enough time around him to recognize the tension in his shoulders, the slight crease in his forehead. Dominic Wolfe did not get blindsided often, and he did not enjoy it when he did. "You don't have to do this," he said finally. "You don't have to walk away from everything we built." She almost laughed at that. "We." As if she had been part of it. As if she had played any role in shaping Olivia Laurent, when in reality, she had simply been placed into the role, expected to perform. "This isn't mine to walk away from," she said. "It never was." His jaw tightened. "You don't believe that?" She sighed, pressing her palms flat against the desk, steadying herself. "I have a son," she said, and just saying the words made her feel grounded. "And he needs me." Dominic's expression shifted, something flickering in his eyes, something she couldn't quite name. "You didn't remember him before," he said, and his voice was softer now, not a challenge but a simple truth. "For 5 years, you didn't know he existed." She inhaled slowly, letting his words settle. "I do now." He looked down, running a hand through his hair. It was the closest thing to vulnerability she had ever seen from him. He let out a small, bitter laugh. "I don't know what I thought." She did. He had thought that Olivia would win. That the life he had built for her would be enough to keep her here, that she would stay because this world was carefully constructed to be untouchable, elegant, seamless. He had thought that because he had given her this life, she would keep choosing it. But he had been wrong. She had a son. She had a past. She had a life that mattered before he had ever found her in that hospital bed and decided to rewrite her story. "I know you meant well," she said, and she did believe that. Even if it had been wrong, even if it had taken something from her that she could never get back, she believed that, in his own way, he had thought he was saving her. "I know you thought you were doing the right thing." He let out a slow breath. "I just wanted to protect you." And maybe, once, she had needed that. Maybe in those early days, when she was waking up in a body she didn't recognize, when her own name meant nothing to her, she had needed someone to tell her who she was. To give her structure, to give her purpose, to give her a place in the world when she felt like she had none. But she wasn't lost anymore. Dominic nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion. And with that, Olivia Laurent ceased to exist. Packing took no time at all. Olivia Laurent had never accumulated much, at least, not anything that mattered. There were a few designer dresses, a collection of curated books on art history, a sleek leather planner filled with exhibition schedules and notes on upcoming gallery openings. A few pieces of jewelry she never wore because they didn't feel like hers. It all fit into a single suitcase. She stood in her apartment, no, Olivia's apartment, for a long time, taking in the space she had called home for the past 5 years. The walls were too perfect, too staged, like a hotel room waiting for its next guest. The furniture was elegant but impersonal. The closet was filled with clothes that looked beautiful but never felt entirely comfortable. None of it mattered. She left the keys on the counter. Then she walked out the door. Moving back home wasn't an easy process. Nothing about stepping back into a life she had been absent from for 5 years could be easy. But it was right. The moment she stepped into her mother's house, the air thick with the scent of something baking, her chest tightened. It smelled familiar, warm, real. Her mother was standing in the doorway, hands clasped tightly together, like she was afraid to reach out, like she was afraid this wasn't real. Naomi opened her mouth, tried to find the right thing to say, but before she could, her mother pulled her into a hug so tight it knocked the breath from her lungs. She held on. And then there was Eli. She spotted him in the living room, small and hesitant, peeking out from behind the couch, his wide brown eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. She knelt down, her heart hammering. "Eli," she whispered, her voice breaking. He hesitated. Then he took a small, tentative step forward. Then another. Then he ran. She caught him, pulling him into her arms, pressing her face into his hair, her entire body shaking. "I'm here," she whispered, over and over. "Mommy's here." She didn't know how long she sat there, holding him. But at some point, she felt his little fingers curl into the fabric of her shirt, holding her just as tightly. That night, she lay in bed in her childhood home, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of Eli's quiet breathing in the next room. She had left Olivia Laurent behind. And for the first time in 5 years, she finally felt like herself. Naomi pressed her hands into the counter, staring at the toaster as if sheer willpower could make it work faster. The kitchen smelled like coffee and slightly burnt toast, and somewhere in the next room, Eli was singing to himself while getting ready for school. The hum of an ordinary morning. A real morning. The kind she had almost forgotten she used to have. Her uniform for work was laid out over the back of a chair, black slacks, a neat white blouse. Practical, unremarkable. A job that made sense. She had taken a position at a small events company in town, helping plan weddings and corporate retreats. The pay wasn't extravagant, but it was steady. Real. Something she had earned, not something carefully curated and handed to her. Most days, that was enough. She buttered the toast and called for Eli. He came bounding into the kitchen, stuffing a notebook into his backpack. He had grown so much. She had missed years of this, years of rushed mornings and sleepy goodnights, of scraped knees and school projects and little hands reaching for hers. "Do I have to eat the crust?" he asked, wrinkling his nose at the toast. "Yes," she said, taking a sip of coffee. "Even if I tell you I love you?" "Especially then." He groaned but took a bite, grinning around it. She ruffled his hair. "Get your shoes on. We have to go soon." After she dropped him off at school, she stopped at the grocery store. While waiting in line, she picked up a magazine from the rack without thinking. Glossy pages, rich colors, the latest features on art and design. And there she was. Olivia Laurent. She wasn't on the cover, but she was in the pages, standing at some impossibly elegant event, surrounded by people whose names carried weight. Her hair was styled in soft waves, her dress sleek, flawless. The caption beneath the photo mentioned her latest collaboration on a museum exhibit in Paris. Naomi closed the magazine and set it back on the rack. She walked to her car, gripping the keys a little too tightly. Most days, she didn't think about that world. Most days, she was too busy packing school lunches, answering emails, making sure Eli had finished his homework. But sometimes, it crept in. The feeling of silk against her skin. The sound of a champagne glass clinking against another. The way people had looked at Olivia Loran, not with familiarity or warmth, but with admiration. Respect. And sometimes, she missed it. She missed the ease of stepping into a room and knowing that she belonged there, that her presence was expected, welcomed. Olivia's life had been polished, effortless in a way that Naomi's never was. Olivia never worried about bills. Never rushed to pick up her son before daycare closed. Never had to triple-check her bank account before buying groceries. Olivia had traveled the world, had curated events in cities Naomi had only ever seen in movies. There were nights when Naomi dreamed about it, about sleek, dimly lit galleries, about conversations with people who spoke in measured tones, about the feeling of being someone important. Then she would wake up, and reality would settle back in, grounding her in the scent of Eli's cereal, the morning rush of getting dressed, the comforting weight of normalcy. She reminded herself that what she had now was real. Olivia's world had been built for her, shaped around her like a perfectly fitted dress, but it had never really been hers. And yet, even knowing that, she sometimes wondered if a part of her had truly left it behind. The phone rang as she pulled into her driveway. She barely glanced at the screen before answering. Hello? There was a pause. And then. Naomi. Dominic. She inhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel. How did you get this number? She asked, voice steady. That's not important, he said. His voice was the same, smooth, controlled, but there was something beneath it. A hesitation, maybe. I just wanted to see how you were. She looked out the windshield, staring at the small house she had rented. The modest front porch, the garden bed she had promised Eli they would plant flowers in this spring. The realness of it. She didn't know what to say. She hadn't spoken to Dominic since she left. Hadn't wanted to. She had told herself that part of her life was over, that it didn't deserve to take up space in her mind anymore. But now, just hearing his voice, she wasn't so sure. I'm fine, she said, finally. Are you? She closed her eyes. I don't know why you're calling, she said. But I don't think there's anything left to say. There was a long silence on the other end. Maybe, Dominic said. But maybe not. She exhaled, rubbing her temple. I have to go. Naomi. His voice was softer now. Almost careful. If you ever. She didn't let him finish. She ended the call. Inside, she placed her phone on the counter, staring at it like it might ring again. It didn't. She walked to her bedroom, pulling open the closet door. Inside, side by side, hung two outfits. One was simple, something she would wear to work. The other was elegant. A dress that belonged to a different life, a different version of herself. She ran her fingers over the fabric, breathing in deeply. Who was she now? Which one would she wear today?